Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are undertaking a profoundly sensitive but really necessary mission. We want to unpack the legacy, the facts, and frankly, the mythology surrounding the Columbine High School Massacre. That was April 20, 1999.
Yeah, and it's a tragedy that didn't just shock the nation. It really fundamentally redefined the landscape of school safety, of mass violence in the U.S. It cast this shadow that, well, it's still over our culture, isn't it? Even 25 years later.
Absolutely. And our goal today for you listening is really to move past some of the simplified narratives that you often hear. We need to synthesize the core facts
Right.
and examine the hidden lives of the perpetrators, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, and try to understand the policy shifts and, I guess, the tragic cultural echoes this event left behind.
And we've got a lot to draw on. There are extensive investigative reports, journal excerpts directly from them, police timelines, sociological analyses done afterwards.
But before we even dive into, the details of their lives, there's something really critical we need to establish up front. It's a fact that often gets overlooked, actually.
It's paramount, yeah. If you only know one thing about the planning of Columbine, know this. It was intended primarily as a massive catastrophic bombing.
Right, a bombing, not just a shooting.
Exactly. The attack was designed, in their minds, to surpass the Oklahoma City bombing. They wanted to cause what they hoped would be the most deaths in U.S. history, the shooting. That was always meant to be secondary.
That single distinction, it changes everything, doesn't it? When we talk about Columbine, we almost always frame it as a school shooting.
We do, but the core intention was this large-scale act of domestic terrorism, really driven by explosives.
So the plan wasn't just random shooting?
No, the source material is really clear. The plan was detonate the main bombs, kill hundreds instantly in the cafeteria, collapse the library above, then use the firearms to pick off survivors, first responders, anyone coming to help. So the entire event, the whole tragedy as we remember it, was fundamentally altered because those main homemade bombs failed to detonate.
So the failure of the bombs actually saved lives compared to the plan.
For better or worse, yes. It significantly contained the death toll compared to what they intended. That failure is key.
Okay, that context is absolutely vital. So we'll structure this deep dive by first looking into the planners, Harris and Klebold, their minds, and maybe the critical signals that were missed.
Yeah, the missed signals are a big part of it.
Then we'll trace the terrifying timeline of the event itself, wrestle with that eternally inconclusive debate over motive, and then finish with the legacy, the scars, the policy changes that came after. Okay, let's start with Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. Harris, his family had a military background, right? So they moved around quite a bit before settling near Littleton, Colorado.
That's right. Klebold, on the other hand, he was a Denver native. Grew up in a more stable environment, pacifist family, Lutheran background. They met, I believe, in middle school.
But the real sort of duality, the hidden life versus the public face, that really started to emerge later on.
It's jarring, that contrast. Especially because the system, the juvenile justice system, actually thought they were rehabilitated.
You're talking about the van incident.
Exactly. In 1998, they were caught breaking into a van, stealing tools, electronics. They pleaded guilty to felony theft, ended up in a 12-month juvenile diversion program.
Which involved things like community service, therapy.
Yeah, anger management sessions, the whole deal. And their records show they did really well in it.
They excelled.
Oh, yeah. They were released early, a month early, actually, for demonstrating good behavior, showing respect, writing apology letters. On paper, it looked like a success story.
Yeah.
The system thought, okay, these kids are back on track.
But we know now from their own writings.
We know now, yeah. From their journals, their tapes. The entire time they were in that diversion program, they were actively plotting the massacre. They were documenting this accelerating malice, figuring out how to build their arsenal. The public persona was just an elaborate and unfortunately very successful deception.
And part of that deception, or maybe the planning, was being recorded online. Harris left a pretty significant digital footprint, didn't he, on his AOL website?
America Online, yeah. It started out relatively innocently, if you can call it that. Initially, Harris used the site to host something called WADS.
WADS? What's that?
For anyone who wasn't gaming back then, WAD stands for Where's All the Data. Basically, they were custom-level files, modifications he designed for the big, ultra-violent video games of the time, Doom, Quake.
So right there, he's already creating these violent scenarios, virtually at least.
Well, absolutely. He was immersed in it. But the site, It mutated pretty quickly. It became a blog. First, it detailed minor vandalism, things they called rebel missions, petty stuff.
But it didn't stay petty.
No. By August 1997, it had escalated. He was posting instructions on how to make and use explosives, specifically pipe bombs. It was basically becoming a digital how-to guide for the attack they were already thinking about.
And this leads us right to one of the most critical failures, one that often gets, well, glossed over. A documented, undeniable missignal. His rage was so public, it was actually reported.
Yes. This is maybe the most tragic what-if in the whole story. August 1997, Harris posts this chilling line online, something like, he wanted to kill and injure as many of you as I can.
And he named people.
He specifically named and threatened Brooks Brown, who was actually a friend, a classmate, just these rage-filled online tirades.
So Brooks Brown's parents saw this?
They did. They saw the site, the threats against their son, and they immediately contacted the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office.
Okay, so the authorities knew about these specific online threats. What did the sheriff's office actually do?
Well, an investigator, Michael Guerra, he drafted a search warrant affidavit for the Harris house. And this affidavit, it was detailed. It recognized the explicit threats, the bomb-making instructions, the sheer level of Harris's malice. It laid out the legal argument to search his home for weapons, materials.
So the document existed, detailing the threat almost 2 years before the attack.
It existed, drafted, ready for a judge.
So why wasn't the search carried out? What happened?
It was never filed. It never went to a judge. The official reasons given later were complex, involving bureaucratic mix-ups, maybe a failure by supervisors to grasp how serious online threats could be back then in that new digital age.
But the affidavit itself suggests they had grounds.
The sheriff's office later claimed they didn't have sufficient grounds, but the affidavit seems to contradict that. This document, and the fact that its existence was kind of suppressed for years afterwards, that became a huge issue in the legal fallout. It represents a documented key failure in pre-event intelligence. The signs are there, the police documented them, and ultimately they were ignored.
So if the website was the blueprint, the journals and tapes they made were more like the raw emotional core. What did those tell us about their inner worlds? They weren't identical, were they?
No, not at all. The source materials paint two very distinct, though maybe complementary, pictures of, well, depravity and despair. Klebold's journals are just drenched in this profound self-loathing, depression, constant suicidal thoughts. He often called it his infinite sadness.
Infinite sadness.
Yeah. He wrote a lot about feeling worthless, his lack of success with girls, and this deep shame about certain sexual interests or fetishes he had. Suggests a really deep internal conflict, real isolation. For him, it seems the attack was primarily a way to end his own life, but with, notoriety attached.
And Harris, his journals were different.
Polar opposite, almost. Harris's journals aren't about self-loathing. They are just exploding with hostility towards everyone, the world. He writes about this terrifying superiority complex, like malignant narcissism, a desire to torture, rape, maim people.
Really dark stuff.
Incredibly dark. His darkest entries mention interest in cannibalism, a clear reverence for Nazi ideology. Just fundamental antisocial malignancy. In one school assignment, chillingly, he detailed a dream he had about going on a massive shooting spree with Klebold.
Wow. So it sounds almost like Klebold wanted to leave the world, and Harris wanted to destroy the world before he left it. Is that fair?
That's the widely accepted analysis, yeah.
Right.
That distinction seems pretty clear in their writings. And then, of course, we have the ultimate planning document, the basement tapes.
Right. The tapes filmed in Harris's basement, most of which were destroyed years later, weren't they? What did they show?
They are just crucial evidence of premeditation and psychological manipulation. In the tapes, they walk through their elaborate attack plans. They show off their hidden arsenal of weapons, knives, bombs. They even demonstrated how they were deceiving their parents, filming right there in the basement, basically turning Harris's home into their command center.
Did they address their families on the tapes?
They did. There's a final segment recorded just about 30 minutes before they left the school. They say goodbye, apologize to certain friends and family members, but they also give specific instructions about disposing of their belongings.
Any sign of remorse for the victims?
Absolutely none. Klebold did leave a personal message saying he loved his mother and family. Harris focused more on his contempt for the world, but zero remorse for what they were about to do. Just total emotional detachment, calculation. The fear that these tapes would inspire copycats, the Columbiners, is exactly why investigators eventually destroyed most of them in 2011. That shows you how potent that kind of documentation was seen to be.
And we even see this sort of warped fantasy playing out earlier in that school video project they did, Hitmen for Hire.
That video is basically a dress rehearsal, wasn't it? They made it for, I think, an economics class. Shows them walking through the school hallways, pretending to shoot fake guns at students they labeled bullies. It's like they were running a script, a blueprint that just moved straight from fantasy into reality.
And speaking of appearances, we should probably address the whole trench coat mafia thing. That was a big media focus early on.
Yeah, it's worth correcting that. They did wear black trench coats on April 20th and in that Hitman for Hire video, but they weren't actually full members of that group, the Trench Coat Mafia, which was though pretty loose clique at the school. The media just seized on the coats because it made for a simple, visible symbol. Wow. The outcast cult look. Easy narrative.
It really speaks volumes about that drive for recognition, that desire for infamy, that Harris actually left a microcassette tape labeled Nixon on his kitchen table. What was on that?
On that tape, he confirms the plan is happening. He says something like, "It is less than 9 hours now," and then, chillingly, "People will die because of me. It will be a day that will be remembered forever." That line, remembered forever. It shows the pursuit of eternal remembrance was absolutely a core motivation, right from the planning stage, the arsenal, and the failed design.
The depth of their planning, that malignant intent, it's maybe best shown by the sheer scale of the weapons and, especially, the explosives they gathered. They used 4 guns during the attack itself.
That's right. Harris had a 9mm Hi-Point 995 carbine rifle and a sawed-off 12-gauge Savage pump-action shotgun. Klebold carried a 9mm Intratec Tech-9 mini pistol, which is semi-automatic, and a sawed-off 12-gauge Stevens double-barrel. They deliberately shortened the barrels of both shotguns, made them much easier to hide under those trench coats, easier to handle quickly. Under federal law, the National Firearms Act, cutting a shotgun barrel below 18 inches is a felony. They cut them down significantly, I think to around 26 and 23 inches total length. So they were committing serious federal crimes months before the massacre, just showing their complete disregard for any rules.
And since they were only 17 and 18 at the time, they couldn't legally buy these guns themselves. Which brings us to that whole national debate that erupted afterward about the gun show loophole.
Exactly. How they got the guns became central to the gun control arguments that followed. The long guns, the carbine, and the 2 shotguns they got through what's called a straw purchase.
Meaning someone else bought them for them.
Right. Their friend, Robin Anderson, who was 18, bought them at a local gun show, the Tanner Gun Show. At that time, in Colorado and many places, private sales between individuals at gun shows didn't require the same federal background check that licensed dealers had to perform. Anderson wasn't ultimately charged, but the way they got those weapons really highlighted what many saw as a huge gap in regulations.
And the Tech-9 pistol, that came through a different channel, also illegal.
Correct. That one was traced back.
Carrick.
Klebold bought the Tech-9 from a guy named Mark Maines for about $500. A co-worker of theirs from Blackjack Pizza, Philip Duran, acted as the middleman. Both Maines and Duran were later prosecuted. Maines got 6 years in prison, Duran got 4.5. So there was this small network, maybe unwitting at first, but still enabling them to get armed.
Okay, so they had the firearms, but the real terrifying scale of what they intended wasn't about the bullets, was it? It was the explosives. This was meant to be a bombing.
The sheer amount of explosive material they put together is just horrifying. They constructed nearly 100 homemade explosive devices in total.
100?
Almost. The inventory included 27 pipe bombs of various sizes, 48 smaller bombs made from CO2 cartridges, they chillingly call those crickets, and then the big ones, 15 propane tanks converted into time bombs. They also messed around with making napalm, had Molotov cocktails ready.
Let's focus on the primary plan, those big cafeteria bombs. Walk us through that strategy.
Okay. The absolute heart of the attack was the school cafeteria. They timed it for around 11:15 a.m., which was the peak of the A lunch shift, the busiest time. They placed 2 large duffel bags inside. Each bag contained a 20-pound propane tank rigged with a timer, gasoline, wiring. They put them near the central support columns of the room.
The objective?
It was twofold. First, the blast itself. They calculated it would kill the estimate was about 488 students inside the cafeteria at that time. Just obliterate them.
My God.
Second, the blast was designed to be powerful enough to destroy those support columns and cause the entire library floor, which was located directly above the cafeteria, to collapse down into the wreckage.
So the structural collapse would have multiplied the death toll even more.
Exponentially.
Yeah.
Just unimaginable carnage. And that wasn't all. They had a secondary, equally cold-blooded plan aimed at the people who had come to help.
The car bombs?
Right. They planted 2 car bombs in the student parking lot, each one rigged with more propane tanks, I think two 20-pounders each, plus gasoline containers. These were timed to explode later, after the cafeteria blast, specifically targeting the police, paramedics, firefighters, even news reporters who they knew would rush at the scene. Pure terrorist targeting logic.
So we have this incredibly meticulous, massive, two-stage plan. Maximum death in the cafeteria, then target the first responders. All designed to achieve Harris's goal of being remembered forever. And yet, the event we actually remember was primarily a shooting spree because of one critical, maybe fortunate, technical failure.
That is the single most important detail to grasp about what happened versus what was planned. The primary cafeteria bombs, the core of the whole attack, completely failed to detonate, probably due to faulty wiring. Maybe the timers malfunctioned. We don't know exactly why.
But they didn't go off.
They didn't go off. Had they worked as intended, the number of dead would have almost certainly been in the hundreds. The entire structure of the school, including that library, might have been pulverized. The massacre shifted in real time from this coordinated massive bombing to a more localized, though still horrific, shooting spree, solely because the explosives they spent months designing and building simply didn't function.
Okay, so the bombs were supposed to go off around 11:17 a.m. They didn't. The actual violence began just a couple of minutes later, right? Around 11:19 a.m.
That's right. Klebold threw a pipe bomb towards the west entrance parking lot area. It only partially detonated. Some students outside saw it, heard it, but initially many thought it was just a stupid senior prank. Firecrackers or something.
That assumption didn't last long.
No. Almost immediately, Harris opened fire with his carbine. He shot two girls sitting on the grass near the entrance. Rachel Scott, 17, was killed instantly. Her friend, Richard Castaldo, was hit multiple times and severely injured, paralyzed.
Harris then turned his attention elsewhere.
Yeah, he fired down the west staircase towards three students who were trying to run away. Daniel Rohrbell, 15, was killed. Sean Graves and Lance Kirkland were badly wounded.
And it's right here, in these opening minutes, that the sources show this sheer, calculated cruelty from Klebold. It really pushes back against that simple, depressed follower idea.
That calculation is undeniable when you look at the accounts. Klebold walked down the stairs towards Lance Kirkland, who was already on the ground, gravely wounded, calling for help. Klebold stopped, looked down at him, and reportedly said something chillingly calm like, "Sure, I'll help you."
And then shot him again.
Point blank in the face with his sawed-off shotgun. Miraculously, Kirkland survived, but the act itself. And then moments later, Klebold literally stepped over Sean Graves, who was paralyzed from the waist down on the stairs, and apparently mumbled something like, "Sorry, dude," almost casually, before continuing towards the school entrance. It shows clear, active participation in the killing, the torture, not just passively following Harris.
Amidst all this horror and chaos, there were these moments of incredible, selfless bravery. The story of teacher and coach Dave Sanders stands out.
Sanders was an absolute hero that day. He was in the cafeteria when the shooting started outside. He immediately understood the danger, started yelling warnings, ran towards the sounds of trouble, and managed to guide dozens, maybe hundreds, of students up a nearby staircase away from the main entrance towards the perceived safety of the second-floor classrooms.
He saved a lot of lives doing that.
Undoubtedly. But tragically, as he was directing students, he ran into Harris and Klebold in the hallway near the library. Harris shot him twice. Sanders managed to stagger and crawl into Science Room 3 nearby, where students and another teacher found him bleeding heavily.
He didn't die right away, did he? But he couldn't be rescued because of the police tactics at the time?
He suffered for about 3 agonizing hours. Students, particularly Aaron Hansey and Kevin Starkey, did everything they could. They used shirts to try and stop the bleeding, kept talking to him, trying to keep him conscious, showing him pictures of his family. They even put a sign in the window, "One bleeding to death."
But the police didn't go in.
The police perimeter held. The standard tactic then was contain and wait for SWAT. They feared the sign might be a trick by the shooters, or that sending anyone in would lead to an ambush, more casualties. By the time medical personnel were finally able to reach him, hours later, Dave Sanders had bled out. He was the only teacher killed, and his death became this tragic symbol of the consequences of that delayed police response.
After Sanders was shot, Harris and Klebold briefly went towards the cafeteria, presumably to check on their main bombs.
Yeah, they went down there, saw the bombs hadn't detonated. They exchanged some gunfire with police who were outside the school by then. Then they headed back upstairs toward the library. And that's where the most concentrated period of violence occurred, between roughly 11:29 a.m. and 11:36 a.m., just 7 minutes.
7 minutes. Set the scene in the library.
It was terrifyingly quiet at first. There were 52 students, 2 teachers, and 2 librarians hiding under tables, crammed between bookshelves. Then Harris and Klebold entered. Harris yelled, "Get up!" He was wearing that notorious white T-shirt with natural selection printed on it. Klebold had one that said "Wrath." They started shouting for anyone wearing a white hat or a sports emblem, the jocks, the athletes they hated, to stand up. "All jocks, stand up. We'll get the guys in white hats."
And the sources detailed just how random but also how targeted the cruelty was in those 7 minutes.
It was both. It began almost instantly. They shot and killed Kyle Velasquez, a special needs student known for being gentle and kind, who was hiding under a computer table near the entrance. Then they just started moving through the library, shooting under tables randomly. Harris walked up to a table where Cassie Bernal was hiding. Witnesses said he knelt down, slammed his hand on the table twice, said "peekaboo," and shot her once with his shotgun.
The recoil from that shotgun blast actually hit Harris in the face, didn't it?
Yeah. Broke his nose.
Yeah.
Reportedly, his nose bled for the rest of the time they were alive.
And the Cassie Bernal shooting, that's where the famous "Do you believe in God" story originated, the martyrdom myth.
Precisely. Very early on, media reports, often based on third or fourth-hand accounts, spread like wildfire. The story was that before Harris shot Bernal, he asked her, "Do you believe in God?" And she defiantly answered yes. It became this incredibly powerful narrative of faith and martyrdom, providing comfort to many.
But it wasn't accurate.
The official investigation, based on detailed interviews with multiple witnesses who were right there, including the student hiding closest to Bernal, Emily Wyant, strongly refuted that specific exchange happening with Cassie Bernal. It seems the student who was actually asked about her faith after being shot, and who affirmed it, was Valine Schnur. She survived. The Bernal story to hold so fast, though, it really shows how quickly emotionally resonant narratives, even if factually shaky, can solidify in the aftermath of trauma.
They also committed acts of horrific, targeted racism in the library.
Yes, absolutely. They found Isaiah Schulz, who was one of the few black students at Columbine, hiding under a table with his friend Matthew Kechter. Klebold reportedly yelled over to Harris, using a racial slur, that he'd found him. They both taunted Schulz with racist remarks before firing multiple shots under the table, killing both Schulz and Kechter instantly.
There were reports of a truly vile comment made then.
Yes, one witness reported hearing Klebold make a repulsive comment about Schulz's brain matter after shooting him, something like, "Look what we have here," followed by a racist remark about black bread. It's just vital context. It shows the motives weren't simple. It ranged from random killing to very specific, hate-fueled targeting based on race and perceived social status.
Did the library violence end abruptly?
It seemed to taper off after an encounter with a student. Klebold actually knew. John Savage, who was an acquaintance, was hiding nearby. He actually stood up and asked Klebold, "Dylan, what are you doing?" Klebold apparently paused, seemed surprised, and just replied, "Oh, just killing people." But then, for some reason we'll never know, he told Savage to run, to get out. Savage fled through the library's emergency exit. After that exchange, and after killing 10 people and wounding 12 more in just those few minutes in the library, the gunman seemed to lose momentum and left a room.
But they weren't done yet. They went back downstairs, still focused on the original plan, perhaps?
It seemed so. Around 11:44 a.m., school security cameras captured them back in the cafeteria. Harris took his carbine and, maybe just out of sheer frustration, started shooting at one of the large propane bombs, trying to get it to detonate that way.
Did it work?
No. It was completely unsuccessful. Propane tanks generally don't explode when shot, unless maybe hit by tracer rounds or something incendiary, which he wasn't using. Then Klebold lit one of their Molotov cocktails and threw it towards the bombs. It started a small fire, but almost immediately the school's fire sprinklers kicked in and put it out. Those sprinklers probably saved the cafeteria from significant fire damage.
And then the end came not long after that, back in the library.
Yeah. They wandered around the school a bit more, shot out windows towards police outside, but didn't seem to target anyone else directly. All gunfire from inside the school stopped around 12:05 p.m. By 12:08 p.m., according to the official timeline, both Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were dead by suicide in the library, near where many of their victims lay.
How did they die?
Harris put his shotgun barrel in his mouth and fired, dying instantly. Klebold shot himself in the left temple with his Tech-9 pistol. The initial police teams entering the library later were extremely cautious because they feared the bodies might be booby-trapped with pipe bombs. That fear further delayed the official confirmation that the event was over and slowed the process of reaching the dead and wounded.
So the final count from the attack itself?
12 students and 1 teacher, Dave Sanders, murdered. 24 others physically injured, some, like Richard Castaldo and Anne Marie Hochhalter, catastrophically. All of that carnage inflicted in just under 49 minutes, from the first shot to the final suicide scapegoating.
So after all that horror, you have this mountain of evidence, journals, tapes, witness accounts, and yet the official motive for Columbine is still listed as inconclusive. The sheriff at the time, John Stone, initially just called it a suicide mission.
That inability, or maybe unwillingness, to pin down a single clear motive created this vacuum. And nature abhors a vacuum, right? So it was instantly filled with competing theories, speculation, and unfortunately, a lot of mythology.
The FBI had a dominant theory, though, based on their psychological profiles.
They did. Based on analyzing the journals, the tapes, their behavior, the FBI established what became the most widely accepted psychological narrative. Harris is the clinical psychopath, arrogant, grandiose, driven by a superiority complex, the calculating mastermind, and Klebold as the severely depressed, possibly borderline personality, suicidal follower who got swept up in Harris's plan.
That distinction, the leader and the follower, the psychopath and the depressive, it was incredibly influential, wasn't it? Especially media coverage in books like Dave Cullen's Columbine.
Hugely influential. It provided a neat, understandable framework. But that theory, while compelling, faces some serious challenges when you dig deeper, especially regarding their mental health complexities. Well, first, while Harris certainly showed many psychopathic traits, the idea that Klebold was just a passive follower is complicated by the fact that, according to some interpretations of their earliest writings, Klebold might have been the first one to explicitly mention the idea of a killing spree, or going in BK, natural-born killer.
NBK.
Yeah, suggesting he might have been more of an originator or at least an equal partner in the ideation phase than the simple follower label implies. But even more critically, there's the toxicology report for Harris.
What did that show?
It confirmed the presence of the antidepressant fluvoxamine, brand name Luvox, in his system at the time of death.
Luvox, that's a significant piece of medical information. How does that complicate the pure psychopath narrative for Harris?
It complicates it profoundly. Luvox is primarily prescribed for severe depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, sometimes severe anxiety or social phobia. Finding it in Harris's system strongly indicates he was undergoing treatment for serious mental distress himself. This could include depression, maybe OCD-related violent intrusive thoughts, possibly suicidal ideation, things that directly conflict with the image of a purely cold, calculating, emotionless psychopath.
So maybe both were deeply troubled, just expressed it differently.
It certainly suggests that possibility. Perhaps both boys were struggling with a similar core of despair or mental illness. Harris channeled his outward into this homicidal rage and desire for destruction, while Klebold maybe internalized his more, leading to that infinite sadness and suicidal focus. The initial resistance by some authorities and media outlets to really grapple with this Luvox finding maybe stemmed from a desire for that cleaner, simpler psychopath-depressive narrative, rather than the messier reality of potentially co-occurring psychiatric conditions in both perpetrators.
And that hunger for a simple motive, a clear explanation, immediately led to these widespread, media-driven myths. The first and probably most pervasive one was that this was all about bullying. Revenge of the outcasts.
That narrative took hold almost instantly. The idea that Harris and Klebold, the trenchcoat mafia guys, were finally getting back at the popular jocks who had tormented them for years. Reports flew around about them being called homophobic slurs, being physically harassed. That specific incident Klebold reportedly mentioned about being hit with ketchup-covered tampons, that was the breaking point.
The public really seemed to need to believe that this horrific act was, at its root, understandable revenge. What did the later, deeper analysis reveal about the nuance there? Was bullying the sole driver?
Later analysis, especially looking closely at Harris's own writings, drastically complicates that simple bullying revenge script. While bullying was undoubtedly a real and serious issue at Columbine, Harris himself was often an aggressor, a bully to others, particularly younger students or kids he perceived as weaker. He wasn't just a passive victim.
And he wrote about the attack happening regardless.
Explicitly. He wrote things like, if people would give me more compliments, all of this might still be avoidable, but probably not. And even more damningly, in his final writings, he gave specific instructions not to blame the school faculty or his family, saying they were doing a fine job. That directly refutes the idea that it was purely revenge for mistreatment by the system or peers. They saw themselves as planning something bigger, more philosophical, almost like an act of terrorism against humanity, not just a high school revenge plot. They weren't total loners either. They had a circle of friends.
So when the focus shifted away from just bullying, the media started looking for external scapegoats. Music and culture came under fire, famously musician Marilyn Manson and the whole Gothic subculture.
Oh, that was a spectacular media frenzy, just fueled by ignorance and fear, mostly. The shooters were immediately, and mostly inaccurately, portrayed as members of some kind of Gothic cult. There were these rampant false claims that they wore Marilyn Manson t-shirts during the attack.
Which they didn't.
No, they wore the Natural Selection and Rap shirts. But news outlets ran these sensationalist headlines, blaming Manson's music, his look. The pressure got so intense that Manson himself felt compelled to publish an op-ed piece. And he made a very sharp point, basically saying the media was desperately grabbing onto easy scapegoats, music, clothes, video games, instead of confronting the much harder questions about mental health access, parental responsibility, and, significantly, gun control in America.
And video games took a similar hit, right? Senator Jeff Sessions at the time really focused on violent games like Doom and Duke Nukem 3D.
They did. And the connections to gaming culture were definitely there, though how much direct influence they had is always debatable. Harris and Klebold were completely immersed in these first-person shooter games. Harris explicitly compared the massacre he envisioned to a mix of historical atrocities and games, like the LA riots, the Oklahoma bombing, WWII, Vietnam, Duke, and Doom all mixed together.
He even named his shotgun.
Yeah, he named his shotgun Arlene, after a character in the Doom tie-in novels. He used gaming slang in his journals, talking about wanting to get a few extra frags on the scoreboard. And Brooks Brown, their friend, later suggested that their choice of pipe bombs might have been partly influenced by how effective those kinds of explosives were, especially in chain reactions in games like Duke Nukem 3D. The sources absolutely show this terrifying blurring of the lines between their violent virtual fantasies and their real-world planning and execution.
So, if the motive wasn't just simple revenge, and it wasn't just external cultural influences like music or games, what did researchers eventually conclude might have unified their intentions?
The most compelling conclusion, I think, put forth by researchers like Dr. Adam Langford, who studies mass killers and also explored by Dave Cullen, centers on the powerful desire for infamy, fame. The plan wasn't just to die, it was to achieve a twisted form of American celebrity through spectacular violence.
Harris said it himself on that tape.
He did. It'll be a day that will be remembered forever. That wasn't an afterthought. It seems to have been a primary goal. Langford's research specifically includes Harris and Klebold in his studies of fame-seeking mass shooters. He argues that the American, maybe global idolization of fame, amplified by 247 media coverage, provided a dangerous blueprint. Their ambition was to achieve this kind of godlike power and eternal remembrance, not through creation, but through utter destruction.
Okay, let's talk about the legacy. The most immediate, concrete, and arguably life-saving legacy of Columbine was the massive shift in police response tactics. That slow, traditional, contain, and wait approach used by law enforcement during the event, which, as we discussed, likely contributed to Dave Sanders' death, came under intense fire afterwards.
And rightly so. The criticism was severe. The old tactic was, first responders arrive, set up a perimeter, call SWAT, contain the situation, try to negotiate. Columbine proved, horrifically, that in an active shooter event, where the goal is killing, not hostage-taking, minutes, even seconds, mean lives. So the entire philosophy of police response had to change, almost overnight. This led to the widespread adoption of what's called Immediate Action Rapid Deployment, or IARD.
IARD. Walk us through what that actually means, how fundamentally different it is.
It's a radical paradigm shift. IARD dictates that the first officers arriving on scene, often just regular patrol officers, not specialized SWAT teams, must immediately move towards the sound of ongoing gunfire. The priority is no longer containment. It's threat neutralization.
So go towards the danger immediately.
Immediately. Officers are trained to bypass wounded victims initially, ignore searching for other potential suspects for the moment, and focus solely on stopping the act of killing as fast as possible. This means forming small teams, maybe just one or two officers, and advancing directly towards the shooter without waiting for the traditional four-person stack or SWAT backup. The whole mindset shifted from stopping people from getting out to stopping the killer from killing more.
That must be an incredible psychological demand on those first responders to run towards gunfire and potentially pass people who need help.
It's an immense burden, absolutely. But tactically, it has proven effective in subsequent events. At Virginia Tech, for instance, and other active shootings, officers trained in IARD were able to locate and engage the shooter, either neutralizing them or forcing them to stop their attack, much faster than the old methods would have allowed. This single tactical change, born directly from the failures at Columbine, is probably the most pervasive and impactful legacy of the tragedy on public safety practices today.
The legal and financial consequences were also pretty significant, weren't they? Although the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office initially used government immunity to shield itself from most major lawsuits.
That immunity protected them from many claims initially, yes. But the settlement related to Dave Sanders' death was a notable exception. That was settled out of court for $1.5 million, essentially acknowledging that the police's decision to hold back medical aid contributed to his death. And critically, the families of Harris and Klebold, along with Mark Maines and Philip Duran, the gun suppliers, eventually settled with the families of over 30 victims.
How much was that settlement?
The total was $2.538 million. Most of that money came from the homeowners' insurance policies of the Harris and Klebold families. It served as an indirect but legally mandated financial acknowledgement of the culpability of those who planned, carried out, or enabled the attack.
And out of that personal tragedy, a powerful political voice emerged, too.
Tom Mauser, yeah. His son, Daniel Mauser, was killed in the library. Tom became this tireless, incredibly articulate advocate for gun control. He focused specifically on closing the very gun show loophole that had allowed Harris and Klebold's friend to purchase those long guns for them. His advocacy really highlights how deeply the personal grief was intertwined with perceived failures in regulatory structures.
Maybe the most disturbing and difficult legacy to really grapple with, though, is what's called the Columbine effect.
Yeah, the Columbine effect. It basically means that this specific tragedy, because of the intense media coverage, the journals, the tapes, the whole narrative around it, provided this terrifyingly recognizable script for subsequent acts of mass violence, especially school shootings.
Script. Like a blueprint.
Exactly. It created a cultural template. The trench coats, the timing near the end of the school year, the documentation through journals or videos, the focus on certain targets, the ultimate suicide. Elements of this script have reappeared again and again. The source materials note that over 70 definite copycat plots or attacks had been documented where the perpetrators explicitly cited Harris and Klebold as heroes, as martyrs, as inspiration.
And that search for infamy, that script, has manifested in really horrific ways in the digital age, hasn't it?
It has. The modern phenomena of Columbiners is a deeply disturbing extension of this legacy. These are online fandoms, essentially, dedicated to the perpetrators. They thrive on platforms that didn't even exist in 1999. Tumblr, TikTok, Discord, forums.
Fandoms for killers.
Yes. These online communities create and share fan art, fan fiction, analysis, even cosplay related to Harris and Klebold. They often portray them as tragic, misunderstood figures or anti-hero icons. It's profoundly disturbing because it grants Harris in particular exactly what he seemed to crave, that eternal notoriety. And it keeps the script alive, visible, and potentially accessible to other disaffected, vulnerable young people looking for a way to express rage or gain attention through violence.
Beyond the policy changes and the copycat violence, the true lasting scars of that day are also found in this tragic list of secondary casualties, people whose lives ended years later, but still as a direct result of April 20th.
This is just a heartbreaking reminder that the violence didn't really end when the shooting stopped. Anne Marie Hochhalter, who we mentioned, was paralyzed from the chest down during the initial attack outside the school. She lived with devastating injuries for decades. She died in February 2025 at the age of 43 from medical complications, specifically a pulmonary embolism directly related to those injuries sustained 25 years earlier.
And her death was officially linked back.
Yes. The Jefferson County Coroner's Office made the significant ruling that her death was a homicide, directly caused by the wounds inflicted by Eric Harris. That ruling officially brings the final death toll from the Columbine attack itself to 14 victims.
14 victims. A homicide ruling 25 years later. That's immense.
It speaks volumes about the enduring physical consequences, but there are also the psychological casualties, the invisible wounds. Austin Eubanks was shot in the library, saw his best friend Corey DePuter murdered next to him. He developed a severe opioid addiction in the years following, partly stemming from the pain medication he was prescribed for his injuries and the trauma. He tragically died of an accidental overdose in 2019.
And there are others, too.
Greg Barnes, who was a close friend of Matthew Kepter, killed in the library, and who had witnessed Dave Sanders being shot. He was apparently tormented by survivors' guilt and trauma. He died by suicide in 2000, just a year after the massacre. These are the ripples, the long-term devastation that continues to claim lives long after the initial headlines fade.
Columbine High School itself had to physically confront the memory, didn't they?
They did. The library, the scene of the worst carnage, was completely torn down and removed during renovations. It was replaced by a two-story atrium, a space filled with light. A new library, named the Hope Columbine Memorial Library, was built adjacent to the west entrance as a separate structure. And of course, there's the permanent Columbine Memorial in nearby Clement Park. It finally opened in 2007 after years of planning and fundraising, providing a dedicated space to honor the victims, the survivors, and the community forever changed by that day. It stands as a permanent marker, a scar on the landscape of American memory.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it seems clear that Columbine wasn't just a simple revenge plot gone wrong. It was far more complex. It was this highly planned, multifaceted attack intended primarily as a bombing.
A terrorist act, really.
Driven by this toxic cocktail of, it seems, severe mental illness, radical and violent ideologies picked up from various sources, and this deeply felt, ultimately successful desire for lasting infamy.
And that very complexity means the ultimate why. The single root cause remains elusive. It's like this constant, painful void right in the middle of all the facts, all the analysis, all the data. We've dissected the planning failures, the missed signals, the tactical changes, the cultural impact. Yet the foundational tragedy of Columbine serves as this stark reminder of the urgent, ongoing need for critical thinking about everything from mental health care access and identification to gun accessibility to how violent ideologies are transmitted and amplified, especially now in our hyper-connected digital age. We have to keep trying to learn from the event that really provided the original blueprints for modern mass violence in schools.
I think the lasting importance of understanding Columbine, digging this deep into it, is recognizing that it wasn't really the end of something. Tragically, it marked the beginning of a new, modern era of violence. The question we should probably all be left contemplating is this. What lessons, beyond just the immediate tactical responses for law enforcement, what deeper lessons must we truly internalize from this foundational American tragedy to ensure that the horrifying script Harrison Klebold created is finally, hopefully, irrevocably broken?